And none of you were here last week, and all those that were here are not for some strange reason, which is divine providence, because we're going to review what we learned. I had wanted to make a chart, and I will. So I'll post the chart, God willing. God will make it some point today, or I hope. And it'll make it easier to review what we just learned now, because there are three opinions. There are three opinions and in the matter. So just to get clear, they're subtle. So here we go. The subject matter, which is this week's Torah portion, which is this time of year, is the prohibition of Chodesh. So let me explain. The Torah says like this. Last week, so we learned the sources inside, we learned the psukim, but I'll just review it. Everybody knows that on the second day of Pesach, the Omer offering is brought. What is the Omer offering? So Omer is simply a measure. It's a measure of a dry measure. That's all it means. It's a dry measure, specific measure, the 10th. It's a 10th of an ephah. What that translates in modern terms, it's about a liter, a small measure. So the Torah says that the nation bring one offering, a liter of grain. The Torah doesn't say what, but we, by tradition, passed down orally from Hashem to Moishe Rabbeinu, it's barley. So a barley offering is offered on the second day of Pesach. It's brought to the temple. There's a whole ritual. It is waved in all 6 directions. It's called, in fact, the Omer HaTnufa, the wave offering. That's how it's referred to. So the basic idea is it's the first thanksgiving for the harvest, which begins with barley. Barley is the first grain to ripen. This is all the simple, short, straightforward level. Barley is the first grain to ripen. It's the first thank you. And the wave, the significance of the wave offering is to invoke. We're asking Hashem that the rain, the dew, the winds, and so on should all be favorable, and you should grant them for a successful harvest. Then, as you know, we're told to count from that day 7 weeks, 49 days. And now another grain offering is offered, this time from wheat. And this time, unlike the Pesach offering, which obviously was not chametz, it's the second day of Pesach. And mind you, all of the grain offerings in the Beis HaMikdash, with only 2 exceptions, were all not chametz, as commanded in the Torah. They should be matzahs year round, because matzahs, we all know, represents humility. And so the whole point of the sacrifice is the surrender to God. So the offering, the accompanying offerings, they're called mincha, the meal offerings of the various kinds, which accompanied every sacrifice, were all matzahs in one way or another, unleavened. The only exception is Shavuos. So Shavuos, the only public offering exception is Shavuos. Shavuos, 2 breads made of wheat, and they had to be bread. It's not our subject now why there had to be chametz, which is strange because Shavuos completes Pesach. You would think if there's any meal offering, a grain offering that would not be chametz, would be Shavuos outside Pesach, because it's the combination of Pesach, the Exodus in order to receive the Torah, and we link the two with this great mitzvah of the counting. And yet Shavuos has to be chametz. We'll deal with that on Friday morning, not now. But the basic meaning of the offering of the 2 breads, which is one of the reasons we have 2 meals on Shavuos, a meat and a dairy, to distinguish one meal from the other. One is meat and one is dairy. It's one of the many reasons for a dairy meal, because of the shtei halechem, the 2 breads that were offered on Shavuos. So you're supposed to wash to these meals and have a different loaf of a different challah for each one. That's the idea. You don't want to have the same challah for both meals, because meat and milk, the knife that cuts it. This is one of the basic reasons for the many other for a dairy meal on Shavuos. It's the shtei halechem. At any rate, at the pshat level, going back now to the pshat level, just also as an aside, and we will speak about this on a Friday morning, the Torah doesn't say that Shavuos is the giving of the Torah. So not even a hint. Well, there's a hint, but no mention that Shavuos is the day of Matan Torah. What is Shavuos at the pshat level? It is the culmination of the thank you. for the harvest season. The wheat is the latest to ripen. And now we're harvesting the wheat. So now we say thank you again. We bring two breads made of wheat. And then after Shavuos begins the ingathering season, which culminates in Sukkot. The three holidays are first and foremost at the Pshat level, agricultural holidays. Pesach is planting, and Shavuos is reaping or harvesting, and Sukkot is the ingathering. Chassidus explains also what this means spiritually, these stages of the growth of the plant, in as much as man is compared to a tree in the field and so on, but not for now. What's our subject? I said our subject is Chodesh and Yoshem. What's going on? So the Torah says it's very clear. The Torah says like this: a person may not, we looked at the sources last week, but a person may not eat, no individual may eat from the new crop and before the Omer is brought. It's like you can't eat without saying a bracha. This is a collective bracha that's said on behalf of the entire people. So the halacha is that any grain that took root before the Omer was offered is permitted for consumption. Any grain which takes root after the Omer is offered, you got to wait till next year. You can't eat it until that thank you was said. And the thank you is said once a year, collectively, when the Omer offering is brought. So that's what Yoshan and Chodesh means. In Utramot and other areas of this bakeries, will have a sign that say, we only sell Yoshan. Yoshan means old grain, as opposed to Chodesh, new grain. Because there is a dispute amongst the poskim, the codifiers, a three-way dispute of the application of this law. Some say it only applies in Israel, not outside the diaspora, and the owner of the field has to be Jewish. Some say it applies even if the owner is not Jewish, and some say it applies even outside Israel, which means it applies all over the world. And then there's a fourth debate: it does depend upon the Omer offering or not, the temple, the existence of the temple. The general consensus is it's independent of the existence of the Beis Hamikdash, this prohibition. So even when the Omer offering is brought or not, that date still remains that critical date, the day when the Omer would have been brought. There is a view that says since there's no Omer offering, the whole thing doesn't apply. But the consensus is it does apply, but within the application, it's how far? Israel, outside Israel. So those are scrupulous, as it were. So they adopt the view that says it applies universally, even here in Canada, anywhere in the world. Therefore, what does it mean practically? That means that any baked goods that you buy or a bag of flour that you buy, so you've got to be sure that this took root before, if it's fresh for this year, like the way you're buying it, any grain you buy now, obviously, it was last summer. That's no problem. But as the year progresses, and the summer and post-summer, next winter, the grain that you're eating, when did it take root? So Yoshan means, we only sell Yoshan means that the grain that we use for our bakery goods, etc., is old grain, meaning it took root before the second day of Pesach, which is obviously true of all grains now, but we're talking again down the road, next winter especially. Then there are those that rely on the opinion that it doesn't apply to outside Israel and doesn't apply to a non-Jewish owner. And then there are others that say also that in general, just the way the market works, the grain that we have is all from the previous summer. In general, any grain you're eating, for the most part, is anyway old grain, if not all of it, depending on the countries, etc. At any rate, okay, so what are we saying? So the Torah says, now I just want to add a parenthesis for a second. I'd mentioned before that all grain offerings, they're called minchas. Mincha means a gift, that's what the word means, but that's the term that's used to describe a grain offering, which is strange. I mean, every sacrifice is a gift. Why is this called a gift? Because the mincha is usually given by a poor person. Some sacrifices have the option to bring a grain, a bird, or an animal. Not all sacrifices have the option, but some do. So the one who brings only grain, suppose he's a poor person, but the poor person, when he gives He's gifting himself. It's much more of a sacrifice than the wealthy person. So the grain offering is called the mincha. It's also one of the reasons mincha is called mincha. Why do we call the afternoon prayer mincha?
It's the shortest?
It's the shortest, yeah. But the upshot is because it's the most difficult. You're really giving yourself. Beginning of the day, you haven't started your day and you daven one thing. End of the day is over. In the middle of the day, the deal, then the stresses and so on, you stop and you daven. That's the expression of the real mincha, the real giving.
It's the biggest challenge.
The biggest challenge, and you've given of yourself in a deeper way. So that's called mincha. And just as since we're talking about mincha, the famous Gemara that Eliyahu Novi, in the famous showdown with the people, follow the prophets of the Baal or not, or God, make your choice. Stop wavering between the two thresholds, God or the Baal. That they were both. Make your choice. It was a big showdown there with the false prophets. And when was he answered? At Mincha. The whole showdown on Mount Carmel took place a whole day from the morning. But Eliyahu, the heavens, Hashem responded and consumed his offering, etc. It's the story we read. We read that story in the Haftarah Pashas Kisisa. Because that's the story of the golden calf. So it's the most dramatic story, and he was answered in Mincha. So that's the famous Gemara that a person should be very careful about Mincha. Know that Eliyahu Novi was only answered in Mincha. Okay, so I said that I just want to add this little parenthesis, but it doesn't matter. We don't have to. It's important to know. So the only chometz offerings of the minchas, the meal offering, was the 2 breads on Shavuos, which I said we'll deal with on a Friday morning. You're invited to join every Friday morning at 6:30. Dave, you know about it? I think I told you. Robert, I told you. It's a nice group. It's on Zoom. Some people come. It's half an hour, 6:30 to 7, and on something for the Shabbos.
Friday morning.
Yeah, I'll add you guys to the list. If you're interested, I'll add you to the list. Yes?
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
Rabbi, I just wanted to ask you one question. What is the view, just the Chabad view on Yashan?
On what?
On Yashan, the Chabad view on Yashan. Do they hold by it?
On Yashan? Chabad is not particular, not so particular. No. That's a whole discussion because Chabad, a chassid, the definition of a chassid actually is someone who's meticulous. But here, it's a complex subject. I just gave it very simply. But bottom line, no. Koshers, that's it.
Thank you.
Okay. So now back to, I wanted to talk about the other exception where we have another David here. 3 Davids today. David Seebeck just joined us. The other exception where the grain offering is chometz, and that is what? The Thanksgiving offering. This is an offering offered by an individual. It's a thanksgiving for Hashem, classically for having been in danger and survived the illness, imprisonment, travel, etc. Which is why you make the bracha after flying overseas or being on a boat overseas. That's considered potential danger. You make a bracha hagoyim. That's in place of the Thanksgiving offering. Every day after Baruch She'amar this morning, if you haven't davened yet, Mizmor Letoda, a song of thanks. That's in place of the Thanksgiving offering. Now that a person brought 40 loaves, 10 of them had to be chometz, which is why we do not say this at Pesach or on Pesach. Also at Yom Kippur, we don't say it because it's eaten at night by the one who brings it. You look at the city, the little instructions, it'll say that. Do not say this, not at Pesach, not Pesach, and not at Yom Kippur. For sure not on Yom Kippur, because it's not in the Yom Tov service. It's only in the weekday service. It wasn't brought on the Yom Tov. That has to be leaven, which is strange. All the sacrifices have to be chometz. So again, we'll deal with the 2 breads on Shavuos, but the Thanksgiving, the korban todah, the Thanksgiving offering has to be chometz. So I want to share with you a reason. I haven't seen it explicitly, but based on what I've learned in Chassidus, it seems that this is fair to say, and that is We all know, as I just said, chametz represents humility, self-surrender, which is why in general the sacrifices may not be chametz. And chametz represents the ego. Chametz rises and so on. Chametz is self-expression, matzah is self-negation. When it comes to saying thank you, don't be humble. When it comes to saying thank you, it's not shkoyach. It's thank you, verbose, be elaborate, appreciative, express it. Be expressive in your thanks. The Thanksgiving offering has to be chametz. It has to rise. Here's where we want to hear your be creative in your way you thank, in your appreciation. Think into what the person did, etc., and be expressive. That's a healthy ego. That's a healthy expression when it's offering thanks. Okay, close parenthesis, an explanation why of all of the offerings that a person would bring, certainly in the Beis Hamikdash, this accompanied the meal offering here had to be chametz. Okay, now get back to our subject. Clear? That was the yeah. Huh? Has to be humble thanks, but a very expressive one. All right, so that's the prohibition of Chodesh. Then the Torah says like this: Shavuos, the halacha is Shavuos, when they brought the two breads, the Torah calls it mincha chadosha. That's the words we looked at it last week. Mincha chadosha, a new meal offering is brought on Shavuos of the two breads. So the Mishnah says, we learned the Mishnah inside last week. We're not going to repeat it again. I'm just going to give the bottom line. The Mishnah in Masechta Menachos, Tractate Menachos, which deals with Menachos Mincha, the laws of the meal offerings. So the Mishnah says as follows, based on the Pesukim, the following halachas. We just learned, number one, we just already shared, that an individual, the private consumption of the new crop is only permissible after the Omer offering is brought. By the way, the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, one of the miracles that happened for the 1,000 years or longer that the Mishkan plus the Beis Hamikdash stood was that there was never a glitch in the offering of the mincha, of the Omer offering. If it became an impure person touched it, this can happen very easily, then becomes impure and you cannot harvest it again. It has to be done one time. Many halachas. This would plunge the entire country into a kind of famine because no one could eat the new crop. Because the Omer wasn't brought. It never happened. There was nothing, it never invalidated the offering of the Omer on the second day of Pesach, which allowed everybody to enjoy the new crop for the year to come. The second halacha is like this. So no one can eat of the privately till the Omer is brought. What about grain used as a korban? Grain used as a korban, you have to wait till Shavuos, to the two breads. The offering of the two breads allows for the new crop to be used as a korban. You follow? The Omer allows the new crop to be used privately. The Shtei Alechem on Shavuos allows for the new grain to be used as an offering. In other words, in the in-between period, once the Omer is brought, everybody can now eat from any crop that had been sowed before this Omer, but after the last one. Now it's no problem. But you can't bring up the new crop yet as a korban till Shavuos. Shavuos, that now allows you to bring the grain as an offering in the Beis Hamikdash for sacrifices, for offerings. Are we clear? That's what the Mishnah says. Then the Mishnah says like this. If a person went ahead, he's always zeroing in on this halacha to understand it. There's three positions. And then we're going to explain it all in the light of Chassidus. That'll be next week. The three positions in the service of God. All right? So let's go. The Mishnah says like this: if a person brought grain that had taken root after the Omer was brought, and it's last year's grain, he has it. The Omer offering hasn't been brought yet, and he's bringing grain. He's bringing this year's grain. Let me make it very simple. He's bringing this year's grain, but it took root after the Omer was brought. He has it in his house, and then at some point down the road, the course of the year, he brings an offering, but this grain took root after the Omer was brought, and he brings it as a korban. So the halacha is it's invalid. It's invalid. No question about it. But what if he brought grain in between the two? In other words, the Omer passed, the Omer offering passed. It took root, in other words, before the Omer offering was brought. So it's kosher for private consumption. He has to wait. It never experienced the Shtei Alechem yet. He should wait for the Shtei Alechem to be brought before he brings it as an offering. He didn't wait for Shtei Alechem, and in between Pesach and Shavuos, he brought it as a korban. He didn't wait for Shtei Alechem. And it's new grain. In other words, this grain is not from last year's, last summer, which was around when the Shtei Alechem was brought. It never experienced, like it wasn't in the world, didn't take root, wasn't around when the Shtei Alechem, the two bids are offered on Shavuos. So you see what he did? He brought it after the Omer was brought. This grain existed after the Omer, took root before the Omer was brought, but he didn't wait for Shavuos. So the Mishnah says you shouldn't do it, but if he did, it's kosher. Now, three explanations, three positions to explain this halacha. Why is it that the Omer is not negotiable for private consumption? If you brought as an offering bread, grain, meal offering that had taken root this year's after the Omer was brought, gunish, nothing but nothing. But if it took root before the Omer was brought, but you didn't wait for Shavuos, shouldn't do it, but after the fact it's kosher. Clear? I'm going to explain now why that is. The first position, this is advanced.
Stuff before the Omer was brought, that's Yosha. It's from the second day of Pesach. From then,
it is already Yoshan, but he brings it between Pesach and Shavuos.
Yeah, but it's from the grain that was made after the second day, not before.
What?
Pesach. Yoshan is everything before the second day of Pesach. The new, this case is talking about a person that brought barley, whatever this carbon, from the new grain that was done after. In other words, done a week after, and then so privately it's okay because the Omer was there. But the question is for the Shavuos one, the Mikvah Chadasha. That's the whole thing. It's not because it was from Yoshan. Yoshan is not a problem. If a guy brings Yoshan, what's the problem? It's from the year before. It's
Not the year before. This year's Yosh. This year.
What Yoshan means from before Pesach.
Anything which took root before Pesach is Yoshan. No. So this grain is such a grain. It is.
What's the question then? If it's Yoshan, there's no problem. The problem is
it's Yoshan, but Yoshan only allows for the personal consumption. Yoshan is not enough.
You're allowed to have the no one already.
For yourself, but not as a korban. He brought.
The question is, this is new grain, and the Omer was brought, so it's okay for private consumption. But the problem is, you can't bring it.
But why are you calling it new grain? It's not new grain. It's called Yoshan. Any grain that takes root before the Omer is brought is called Yoshan. That's called Yoshan.
Yoshan, you're allowed to.
Personal, not as a korban. You have for bringing as a korban, you have to wait till Shavuos. No, that's what happened. It is a personal consumption is okay, but he didn't wait till Shavuos, and he bought this grain also as a korban.
Anything from the year before already won on the other.
So it's not from the year before. It happened right now.
It's not from the grain that happened from.
It's 7 weeks. It grew in the between. It was planted before Pesach. This is what happened. This make it very physical, clear. This is grain that took root before Pesach. Took root. And then between Pesach and Shavuos, it ripens. he harvested. It hasn't come Shavuos yet. He can eat it himself because it took root before Pesach, but he can't use this grain now as a korban. He got to wait till Shavuos. He didn't wait. He bought it as a korban between Pesach and Shavuos.
But you don't need the omer for that. It's Yoshin. You don't. Why do you need the omer for it if it's old flour?
What?
Why do you need the omer for Yoshin? Yoshin is already permissible because it was from the year before. It's the new grain that you need the omer.
You're confusing what? Confusing with new grain. The definition of new grain is one thing and one thing only. New grain means took root after the omer. Old grain took root before. So listen to the scenario. This is grain that was planted before, seeds that were planted and took root before the omer. Once the omer comes, this is now called Yoshan. This is Yoshan grain because it was around in the world when the thank you to God of the omer was brought. It then grew between Pesach and Shavuos. It completely grew up. He harvested it. And now he's bringing this as a korban. It's before Shavuos. He didn't wait for Shavuos. So the Mishnah says you shouldn't. You should wait for Shavuos. Shavuos needs it in order to bring from the new crop, which is Yoshan for it's old for private consumption, but still considered new. That's why we confused here when it comes for a korban. You need like a 2 Yoshan thing for a korban. It's got to be the omer and Shavuos. You following the case? So now this is what we're talking about. He didn't wait for Shavuos, and he brought it as an offering to the Beis Hamikdash. So the Mishnah says, well, the omer passed, therefore, b'diavad is kosher. Had he brought grain before that took root, that grew, that was harvested, and never experienced an omer, period, it's nothing worth the korban. But because this took root before the korban omer, he harvested afterwards. For private consumption, he could use it. He should wait till Shavuos. He didn't. After the fact, it's kosher. So now, okay, 3 positions. Guys, we're all clear so far. It's a little bit, yeah. Now comes the complicated part. The three, and I'll send you a chart. I'll post it on the WhatsApp, Mr. Shem. 3 positions to explain this halacha, to explain why b'di'evad, after the fact, if you brought this grain, as long as it was around for the omer, even if you didn't wait for the shtei alechem, it's b'di'evad kosher. So the position advanced by the Rashba is like this. He says, that it's one prohibition. This prohibition with respect to private consumption and to bring as a korban is in essence one prohibition. God is saying, the Torah is saying, don't touch the new grain. Not for you, not for sacrifice, not for private, not for korbanos. It's one prohibition. And it's lifted, it's one prohibition. In other words, it's if to say like this, I'll rephrase it, make it clearer. The new grain's not to be touched. One prohibition. The prohibition is lifted in stages. When it comes to the omer, one stage is lifted, so the prohibition is now weakened. You may now use it. Then it comes to the shtei alechem, second prohibition is lifted, it now can be used for korbanos. So since it's one prohibition, and the omer was brought, so the prohibition has been weakened. There's been one restriction already pulled. So since it's weakened, you should have really waited for the what? The shtei alechem. But since at least you waited, this is grain that took root before the omer was brought. This prohibition, this part of the prohibition you respected. It's like bandages, or you're being untied. There's 2 knots, or it's one big knot. Maybe it's one big knot. So it's loosened to some degree, and then it's loosened completely. So that explains, since the prohibition is not in the full force that it was initially, after the fact, if you brought it as an offering, it's kosher. Are we clear? This is the reasoning why you should wait, because there is still a prohibition, but it's a weak prohibition that still remains in force, that says you got to wait till Shavuos. Why? Because it's all one prohibition in the first place, And since part of it has already been lifted, the whole prohibition in totality has been weakened. That's the Rashba. We clear? Now a second view. A second view that says, which is called the Taras HaKodesh and other Achronim. They say no. They advance the following explanation. Again, I'm just giving you a heads up. We're going to go at the end, explain all of them, that they're all true in the light of Chassidus and what this whole thing means spiritually. The new grain, the old grain, private consumption, offering in the Beis HaMikdash. On the surface, has nothing to do with us today, really, except whether you do or not eat Yoshan Chodesh. But spiritually, we're going to see it applies to everyone in a very intimate way, like everything in Torah does. Okay, so God willing, next time. But let's get the three opinions. Second opinion says like this: no, they're not. It's not one prohibition; it's two separate prohibitions. However, to begin with, the prohibitions are different. The prohibition for private consumption, to begin with, is absolute, not negotiable. Which means that till the Omer is brought, you may not eat it, you can't use it for a korban, no use, nothing, finished. The second prohibition, however, which deals with the sacrifices, with offerings, to begin with, doesn't have this prohibition to it, because we have a principle that says when it comes to the laws related to sacrifices to Kodshim, we need the Torah to repeat explicitly a negative prohibition. It can't be just do it this way. In order to make it absolute, which means that there is no wiggle room even after the fact, it's not enough just to say do it like this. It also has to say, and don't do it otherwise. When it says and don't do it otherwise, then then even after the fact it is invalid, and there's no room for, if after the fact you didn't do it exactly this way, it's still acceptable. When many laws are like that. So you're seeing why sometimes it is, why some laws it's not negotiable, some laws is you should do it this way, but if you didn't, it's still kosher. Hundreds of laws like that, hundreds of halachas. Why? So one of the rules is, when it comes certainly to, in our case, to sanctified food, is that not just sanctified food, all laws concerning the Beis HaMikdash offerings in the temple, in order to be, even after the fact, no room for any deviation at all, no room for any compromise. In order to make it absolute, it's got to be not just do it like this, do not do it any other way. Here it doesn't say that. You don't find the Torah says about this, the 2 loaves of Shavuos, and do not bring any korban until the 2 loaves are brought. It's implied, because it says this is the first one. But since the Torah doesn't spell it out, it's allowing for, well, if you waited till after the time that you can use it privately, it's kosher. Clear? So it's a different view. And he's saying like this: the first one is absolute. The second one, to begin with, was not commanded in this absolute, not negotiable format. But they're 2 separate prohibitions. Unlike the first view, which is it's one prohibition lifted in stages. So it's weakened after the Omer offering is brought. It's weakened because it's one prohibition. The second view says it's weak to begin with, not weakened because you brought the Omer. They're 2 separate prohibitions. One is absolute, the one to begin with is not. Now, just to make it clear, I don't want to confuse you. The truth is, when it comes to the Omer, it also doesn't say do not bring. It just says this is the first, that the Torah just says that you only eat of the new crop once this is privately, once this is brought. It doesn't say that, and do not eat till this is brought. So why is that not negotiable? It's for another reason. I'm just adding this here, is because it's not yours. In order to bring a korban, it's got to belong to you. Since the Torah says it doesn't belong to you till you bring the Omer offering, then you can't use it as a korban. So it's tantamount to adds up to an outright prohibition. In other words, there is a prohibition. The prohibition says you have to bring what belongs to you. It doesn't belong to you. You have no right to it. You have no entitlement to the new grain until the Omer offering is brought. So how can you bring this a korban? A korban's got to belong to you. Okay, close brackets. Let's just keep it simple a little bit. And we're saying the second view is saying, unlike the first view that says it's one prohibition lifted in stages, the second view is saying is the two prohibitions, and the first one is not negotiable. The second one, the Torah to begin with, did not convey it in a way it's not negotiable because it doesn't add, you shall not bring a korban until the two breads are offered. Therefore, it's weaker. Therefore, as long as it's your grain and you can offer it private consumption, if you bring it as a korban after the fact it's kosher. Third view is the most interesting view. And the third view says there's actually no prohibition whatsoever altogether. When it comes to the shtei alechem, there's no prohibition here at all. So what is it? The Torah is just saying, your first korban should be, let me rephrase that. It's not about that you should not bring a korban till the two breads are brought. The focus is not your korban. Don't bring your korban until the two breads are brought in Shavuos. That's not the focus. Torah is saying the two breads of Shavuos should be the first grain. You want that to be the first grain. It's a mitzvah that the two breads of Shavuos be the first offering brought from the new grain. It's about the two breads on Shavuos, not about your korban. So if you bring your korban after the Omer, but before the Shtei Alechem, your korban is 100% good, but you ruined Shavuos. Shavuos should be from the new crop, the first one from the new crop, and you got yours in first. You ruined Shavuos. It's not about your korban. Your korban is 100% good. Once you can eat it personally, bring it as a korban. No problem as far as your korban is concerned. There's another factor here. Hashem says, I want that the two breads on Shavuos, that should be the first offering that's brought of the yoshin of the new crop, which is now after the Omer. So if a person brings his korban's 100% good, but what did you do? You just messed up Shavuos. It's no longer the first. It's a completely radical different view. And he says, because you look at the Torah, all it says is, it's a mincha chadasha, the first offering should be the first bread. It's all about the Shavuos offering, not about a prohibition for my sacrificial offerings, my minchas. So what's a practical nafkamina, practical difference? If someone went ahead and did what we just described, he brought his korban after the Omer, didn't wait for Shavuos. Is there any point for anybody else not to bring it? According to the third view, no point. Anybody else, the gate is open. Anybody can bring the korban because already Shavuos is not going to be the first one. You've already compromised the Shavuos offering, so there's no point in anybody else being told you can't bring yours. But according to the first two views, it's about the individual sacrifice. Then even if someone did it, it doesn't mean someone else should do it, of course. The prohibition is in force. It's a weaker one. It's whatever the two explanations, but it's still there. It's still present. So b'di'evet, it's only good b'di'evet, but in the first place, don't do it. But according to the third view, it's not about your korban. It's about Shavuos being the first offering. Then once someone, did it, then there's no point anymore. It's no longer going to be the first anymore. Everybody else can bring. You can bring from the, no problem whatsoever of individuals bringing their korbanos. Okay, friends, we'll stop here. I'm going to send a chart, God willing, that will make it easy. You'll see it visually on the page. And the main thing of our talk is going to be to explain all of this in the light of Chassidus.
Rabbi, so
Three levels of the service.
In the third view, what would happen to Shavuos?
What?
For the third view, what would happen with Shavuos? You don't celebrate Shavuos?
I mean, it should have been the first sacrifice, and it's not. So it's still brought, but it's missing this desired property. Number one, the mincha chadosh. It's not the mincha chadosh. They would still bring it.
So what happens? What happens to the prayers? You can't say that this is the first grain anymore.
There's no prayer that says this is the first grain. There's no such prayer.
Okay.
No, there's no prayer.
Okay.
So Rabbi, no class next week because of the trip?
No, the morning class will have.
Oh.
This one will have, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Oh.
I don't see why not. We have to be 10:30 there at the airport. So
Oh.
no, why
Okay.
not?
Super. Okay, wonderful.
We have to. It's a cliffhanger, and I don't know if things get too much time to pass. So God willing, I'm going to work on making a nice sheet. You'll see it visually, the three views, and then again, the main thing is, so what is it saying to me and you? That's the beauty of it all. Okay, friends.
Right then.